So, good morning everybody to our series of the project Striking from the Margins, Religion, State and Disintegration in the Middle East. It is a very great pleasure to have today Professor Ayse Caglar speaking, our dear colleague. Ayse speaking at the seminar, and we just noted that it attracted quite an audience and a different audience than we usually have. So obviously we have entered here a good terrain with both the speaker and the topic of today. The theme of today, and actually it was scheduled for the next 3 weeks to have a Turkish block opening, to shift a little bit the focus from Arab countries to the neighboring countries, because as you will also hear in a short while, that's what we do and what we are concerned with when we do and study Iraq and Syria. We can't do so without the context of neighboring countries. We had invited for next week, let me just announce it for those who haven't seen that we withdrew that poster, Professor Dennis Caniotti from SOAS, who unfortunately will not be able to come next week, but we are planning to reschedule her talk when it will be again possible for her to travel. Today's talk, Migrants and Disempowered Cities, Opportunities, Challenges and Polarized Dynamics, is from the very rich research and publications of Professor Caglar, who is a renowned scholar in migration studies with a special focus on urban, or including urban studies. Many of you, and I heard that there are some students, we had the pleasure and the privilege here at CEU that Professor Caglar, before she moved some years ago to the University of Vienna, where she holds the chair for, what is the proper title, Anthropology, right?
I don't know. Proper title.
Anthropology.
These things never match in that part of the world.
Anthropology. She was professor and head of department of the Department for Sociology and Social Anthropology. I hear that we have to speak louder without the micro. She has, if I may say so, really raised a whole generation already at CEU of students who are doing brilliant work both at the university here, but also have moved ahead. So she has in that indeed formed the school, these two publications, one forthcoming, but the other already widely used, that she co-authored with Nina Glick-Schiller, Locating Migration, Rescaling Cities and Migrants, which was published by Cornell University Press, and forthcoming, it's not yet out, no?
But it should be in 2-3 months out.
Yes, we're very much looking forward to this. Migrants and City Making, Perspectives on Dispossession, Displacement and Urban Regeneration. As is the habit in the seminar, we don't do too lengthy an introduction, but rather focus on the paper and discussion. And as you will see, the discussion will center very closely on the work that Professor Caglar is conducting. But we ask her, and this is for us, for the research group, and for Striking from the Margins, an aspect of the research that is of utmost importance and on which we haven't done so much yet, and therefore we are very much looking forward, Ayse, to your talk. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for this generous introduction and lengthy introduction, actually. And thank you very much for the invitation and for giving me a chance to share my work with many of you, former colleagues, former students, current colleagues. So I'm very happy to be here. What I would like to do today is that, you know that I neither work on radical movements nor on Middle East, particularly, and I know that this has been your focus in terms of the relationship between religion and state, and actually the only part of religion that I have worked was on Christianity, nothing to do with much with Islam, born against, but I still, although despite these differences between the focus of my work, I still think that my work could converse with the issues that you're addressing within this Striking from Margins project, especially in terms of the situating those kinds of movements and their empowerment in the broader dynamics. So I hope so. We will see whether it would converse or not. I'm not going to focus very much on, to disappoint you, Nadia, maybe, on Turkey, but some of the examples are from there and we could expand on that. I have not worked on Turkey for a long, long time, and I'm only coming back to Turkey. It's part of the book One City, One Border City between Syria and Turkey. So the empirical material is coming from there too. But I would focus more on the theoretical frame and then bring up some of the empirical issues. We could expand in terms of the in the questions if you would like to. So I'm gonna try my first 101 stuff.
The other way.
Other way around.
The other way around. Okay. I thought that this should go back.
101.
This is 001. So I would like to start by underlining two fault lines of the scholarship on policies on the relationship between migrants, migration, and cities. Main hindrance, I think, in terms of those fault lines is the methodological nationalism on which I have been writing for a while, which manifests itself in migration scholarship in two drastic ways. One is in the, and especially also in the urban studies. One is the ethnic lands, where that you take the ethnic group as the unit of analysis, despite all this kind of the lip service paid to the fact that ethnic groups, ethnicity is a product, it is constituted, but still it acquires a kind of a unit of an analysis. This holds the migration scholarship still, I think, despite the ones that who argue against methodological nationalism in grip. The other one is in the urban studies, and except a few studies that focus on migrants' lives and social relations in cities that are not global centers of economic, political, and cultural power, the scholarship on the relationship between cities and their migrants mostly concentrate on metropoles and or gateway cities. It is for sure that there's a projection that in 2050, 60% of the world population will be living in cities. It's for sure not this 60% will not all be living in cities which are global powerhouses. So they will be living in cities of varying scale. In fact, there is already a pattern of migrant refugee settlement in small or quote-unquote mid-range cities. So I think we need to counter the methodological nationalism of most of migration and policy studies, which generate theories on the basis of research, on the basis of working on the dynamics that take place in those kind of metropoles or gateway cities, to be generalized to the whole, quote unquote, the nation state. That there is a methodological nationalism behind that, as if that the nation state territory were homogeneous. So this is what I refer to the generating theories about the migrant settlement or refugee settlement on the basis of studies on particular paradigmatic cities. So we need to look at it in terms of the settlement patterns or dynamics in cities of varying scale. The second is that, so this is ignoring the different dynamics in cities of varying scale. I do not use the language of size, small cities, mid-sized cities, but scale, because scale is very much related with power, and size is not a very good indicator of power, although related, but not directly. So this is, and this kind of generating theory and policies from the particular experiences of those very powerful cities or relatively powerful cities becomes even more problematic in the context of uneven development, in the context of neoliberal globalization. Second point is that the fault lines. One was the methodological nationalism, and the second one is that the urban redevelopment narratives mask growing inequalities within, and between cities. The interrelated processes of wealth generation through urban redevelopment, that we know that there are increasing disparities, and despite policies of scholarship that portray cities as engines of development, generating wealth and new forms of governance and power in ways that would benefit, as if it would benefit the vast majority of urban residents. These urban growth narratives, which are often celebrated as quote-unquote metropolitan revolution. If you look at the Brooks Institute publications, you will all see metropolitan revolution, cities are the engines of growth, and that will trickle down. I think they mask growing inequalities within and between cities, especially in the context of capital restructuring and urban restructuring. They fail to acknowledge the displacements, dispossessions, and contestations underlying the urban restructuring. So I think we need to address the interrelated processes of wealth generation through urban redevelopment and increasing disparities and migrant settlement. So look at the migrants, or you could look at it also not only migrants, which I will come to it, as marginalized groups, that we need to look at them within a broader dynamics, what is happening in terms of which comes together with the urban and capital restructuring. So Okay, so how could we counter these tendencies? Actually, this is what we have tried to do in our upcoming book. First, focus on the relationship between migrant dynamics and urban restructuring in cities that are not global powerhouses, that lack adequate economic, political, and cultural power. So that's why I called that the disempowered cities, which I will come back to it, because disempowered cities is not necessarily powerless cities. They're powerless, but there's a particular trajectory for their powerlessness. Among such cities that experience restructuring processes from within a more structurally disadvantaged position than those identified as quote-unquote global cities, we focused on those disempowered cities, which are marked by decimated economies, by loss of population, loss of tax base, and above all, loss of economic, political, and cultural power. But I said that there are so many cities which would fall into this, and still I would be uneasy to call them disempowered. They might be powerless cities, but the disempowered cities are those ones which had a powerful position before. So they have a memory and a trajectory to connect back to their either economic or political, cultural power. So the cities that we have worked was that the Halle is Germany, Halle an der Saale, and Manchester, New Hampshire, and Mardin. Mardin was never an economically powerful city in that sense, but it was a very powerful city at the crossroads of trade and then the cultural and religious education for religion also. And Halle was industrially very important, and Manchester's, of course, that the mills and that. So these were the places where they know and they have a memory of their powerful past. But they share the fate. Yes. They share the fate with so many others that they are quote-unquote shrinking cities. I think shrinking cities is not a good terminology because it does not tell you the change of the composition of the cities. So it's not simply a loss of population, but we could say that they are losing tax base and that. So, but we also, to counter the tendencies that I referred to, which happen to be the fault lines for hindering us to look at the migrants and city-making processes, I think we need to have a new analytical vocabulary which might take us outside of the methodological nationalism. Why do we need a analytical vocabulary? First, to capture how city residents participate in the processes and struggles that remake their cities beyond the canonized ways, whether they pay this or that, or whether they contribute to this kind of labor force or not, kind of a broader. To approach, second, we need an analytical vocabulary to approach the urban inequalities and disparities in relation to the dispossessive processes which I referred to that we were not being able to see, and displacements underlying wealth generation through urban redevelopment. So my main first concern is that we are operating in a world where that the wealth generation is geared through urban redevelopment in the cities. And third, to capture the interdependencies among these processes, as well as the common conditions of precarity and displacement which mark the lives of many urban residents, migrant as well as non-migrant, which are often glossed over by urban redevelopment narratives. So it is, if we go back, that I said that it masks the inequalities and the dispossessions that's taking place. And this is not only taking place in relation to the migrants. So in terms of, instead of trying to focus on migrants as a distinct analytical kind of a group, or taking the ethnic lens as an analytical unit of analysis, we need a kind of an analytical vocabulary to get the commonalities of the precarities that result from those urban restructuring. So these are, I think that these are the ones that we have to, yes, counter the fault tendencies which I identified as the fault lines. So the building blocks of a new conceptual network is that I am aware of this hype with mobility. Everyone is talking, all projects focus on mobility, but I think rather than mobility, I don't think that mobility is a very suitable concept to do this. So by using displacement as an analytical tactic, in the sense that Saskia Sassen used, we try to make series of interrelated processes which are obscured by the concept of mobility visible. Because I think that the mobility concept makes us veil some of the processes. It fails first to draw attention to the importance of looking at the interrelations between displacement, dispossession, and accumulation underlying migration and urban regeneration. So mobility shifts our attention to somewhere else. The concept of displacement might enable us to draw attention to those entangled processes underlying also migration. That is, migration is, yes, the spatial mobility, but spatial displacement, but behind that there are some dispossessions behind that. So to be able to connect to those processes to each other, and to be able to see how seemingly independent processes and locations, as well as institutions, are ultimately connected with each other, because mobility is it is more on the action. Actually, there's displacement structurally and institutionally connects different processes and different places. And on top of that, as the critical scholars of mobility underline, mobility is a very slippery concept in analyzing migration and migrants' relations to city. The nation-state often occupies a central role in defining and institutionalizing what counts as mobility and what kinds of mobilities are rendered invisible. Not every mobile person is designated as a migrant. Expats, they're not under that category. And there are many people who are designated as migrants who had not moved from anywhere to anywhere, second, third generation, but they are still, the mobility actually, that it is very much like seeing like a state with Scott, and I know that Pram's work also, that with the groups of people that we connect with kind of generate mobility, actually immobility is characterized part of their lives. So that is, I think that we have to, for this conceptual network, displacement rather than mobility is a better one. In our analysis of those three disempowered cities that I referred, we explore forms and processes of dispossession and displacement and ask how, when, and with what consequences dispossessed and displaced people, both migrants and non-migrants, reconstruct their lives within these urban redevelopment processes in the cities. How do they become valorized, devalorized within the process of city making? And how do they become a value, or positively or negatively? And finally, how are they emplaced in these disempowered cities? So, like the concept of displacement and placement, I will explain a little bit that it is not in terms of that the kind of the integration. And placement is also central to the analytical framework that we think that we need. We define as placement as the relationships, as the relationship between the continued restructuring of place within multiscalar networks of power. I will come to that, what I mean by multiscalar, and the person's efforts within the barriers and opportunities that the contingencies of local placemaking offer to build a life within networks of local, national, supranational, and global interconnections. It is not trying to mark a new place by finding a new word, but emplacement, as you see, first of all, it's a processual concept. Second, it is, you could say that integration is also a processual concept, but this is first of all, it puts our attention to the barriers or opportunities that the contingencies of local placemaking offer. So it puts us into space and time, and a particular space and time. It is not a kind of a general one. And also which allows us to situate all residents of a city within the transformation of space over time by linking space, place, and power. So it is not that the integration to a group of people where it is not everyone needs to be emplaced somewhere. And that happens in the context of, within the opportunities and the constraints of a particular given time. So displacement and emplacement are interrelated processes of restructuring of space, social relations, at particular points of time. Unlike the term of integration and assimilation, this concept both invokes a sense of placemaking and allows us to focus on a set of experiences shared by people who are generally differentiated by scholars and policymakers as either migrants or native. So I'm trying to get out of the, as I said, that we miss the commonalities, the shared experiences. So I'm trying to trying to find an analytical vocabulary to capture them. So by speaking of emplacement, we can situate migrant and non-migrant displacements within the globe-spanning but locally and temporally situated neoliberal processes of the destruction and reconstitution of capital. I will come to the temporality aspect too, and I think that this enables us to capture the importance of the temporality, what we are talking about. Okay, this conceptual network, your challenge, but this is what I'm proposing, enables us to move beyond some binaries dominating migration scholarship. It enables us to approach the dynamics of migrants and those who see themselves as natives, because these are very fluid signifiers, in city making within the same analytical framework, so that we could address common conditions of precarity and opportunities and displacement many urban residents are subject to. By situating migrants as contemporaries of all other urban residents, that is to say, being subject to the constellation of the social forces active in that place at that time, and then not ripping them off a priori into the culturalized worlds that in terms of which comes together with the ethnic and cultural lenses. So we try to, in this way, we could analyze them, analyze their practices as coeval, sharing the same space. And this is, we know that from colonialism, this is where the actually basic violence appears, that situating people, inscribing the people different times and different places. So that once we do that, it becomes clear that all city inhabitants, migrant or not, build their lives within the processes of displacement and emplacement that are enabled and shaped by power geometry of that particular historical conjuncture. Of course, they do this with unequal access to resources like everyone else, but the migrants do not have, sometimes even that the legal criteria will not completely differentiate them from the quote-unquote native. So this will enable us to do what I thought that we should be doing. So, but why to focus on disempowered cities? I said that okay, there is a little bit, there's less attention generating the theories from the other, but this is not only the reason. I think the disempowered cities provide us a very a good opportunity to observe certain processes that might remain veiled in the cities with global power. So what we did in our comparative study, we explored the emplacement of migrants in these cities which are disempowered in terms of access to national power. These cities are disempowered, have little power in terms of accessing to the national power. Capital investments, if this is the basics for that generation of wealth and today's world, global talent, and position within global networks of power, and they have limited resources of and power. So we thought that first in cities with limited power, this we saw actually from the empirical material, the multiple ways migrants contribute to the multifaceted aspects of city making can be more readily studied. Although migrants, they become neoliberals with their neoliberal subjectivities, they become real estate brokers, they become part of then it opens a kind of a very different area of research than what you normally do in migration scholarship. And although these multiple pathways of emplacement are present in more powerful cities, studying them in these cities of limited resources might provide new insights into the different opportunities that emerge in these places for migrants, as well as insights into the dynamics, contradictions, and effects of dispossession and displacement underlying urban redevelopment. I underline the contradictions because that, if you could keep it in mind, that I will come back to it in relation to the polarized politics and the radicalization of the political field in that relation. So in the contradictions of these processes become more visible in these disempowered cities. The cake is so small there. In terms of the possibilities, so your relative weight acquires a very different meaning. And what we have seen is that in local leaders and policymakers in disempowered cities often become more aware of the importance of migrants. It was very striking that we started at the turn of the millennium, that we started looking since then in all those cities, those disempowered cities, which were very surprisingly, there was a very positive narrative, welcoming narrative for the migrants, which goes against actually our common sense that is shaped by the metropoles are the most open places. Metropoles provide all the opportunities to the migrants. Actually, the disempowered cities might be providing very different kind of opportunities for them. And the fault lines of neoliberal urban redevelopment and the dispossessions and displaced underlying urban regeneration, they become more visible because of the limited funds and power there too. In those places, things break down much more easily in a much more drastic way. City debt, it just the moment that the city debt increases drastically, the people feel it very, very strongly in these cities of very limited power. So I think it is important to come to the broader context of strategies and policies of urban redevelopment, because I put it there because I know that this project is in the history department, and I'm not talking about all the cities in history. I'm talking about that the urban generation of wealth in a particular context, in a particular broader context. And so in order to be able to situate the strategies and policies of the city leaders seeking accumulation by revitalizing the city in neoliberal globalization, we have to take this context into generation. This is the context which cities come to play prominent roles as strategic nodes of capital flow, units of governance with powers of taxation and local development. This is the context in which cities increasingly unleash themselves as engines of economy, centers of trade, investment and innovation from the federal and national state. And this unleashing, related with the restructuring of capital, is the part of the changing configuration of state and local power. This is where maybe we could relate it to that in terms of the state and religion, that you're looking at it, that state and it's not, that the state is not in a way kind of the monolithic, especially in relation to the different places where those religious practices or movements are establishing themselves. These dynamics alter. This is of course related with the restructuring of capital. But what happens, I think, what is very important for our research that came out, and then I feel very strongly about that, is that these dynamics alter the value regimes in cities. All urban resources acquire a new value. Within the city's competition to reach out, global, regional, state, non-state, supranational institutions and their funds to attract capital investment to the city for generation of wealth. So it is there, then you have to, like a real estate developer, you have to look at it. What do you have? What could I make out of this plot? What could I make with this kind of the human resources, quote unquote, human capital, all sorts of capital. So different segments of cities' population, places, practices, built environment, histories acquire value once they become assets for capital accumulation through urban regeneration. So it just brings a very different kind of a value regime. Faced with these challenges, city leaders of disempowered cities also, they revisit their city's resources. This is the game in town. That is, you can't be outside of it. And within that, we saw that migrants or certain groups become, who were marginalized, could become valorized. They might acquire a new value. It might be not in terms of economic value, but they might be a very important venue to reach out powerful institutions or supranational institutions, to UNESCO, to UNDP, for the kind of the institutions who are active in human rights regimes. So they might become who might have not had a value before. And actually for Mardin, where I looked at the Syrian Christians, actually these were the people who were chased out, they fled for their lives, and they acquired a value in that city at a particular time. So this is, was this? No. So what do I have?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. This.
The other.
Okay. So here I think we need a kind of a caveat for the regimes of value in context to in connection to the global movements of capital. I have dealt, as I said, that elsewhere with the striking change in the value of an extremely marginalized minority group. When I situated their revaluation processes, including their prominence in the cultural, religious, linguistic diversity narrative in Mardin, within a multiscalar analysis, then it was very striking that how it correlated with that, how it came together with the efforts to revitalize and to reposition that city. I draw in the regimes of value, I draw on studies on regimes of value that show revaluation is connected to global movement of capital accumulation and its temporalities. I argue for approaching these devaluation and valorization processes of different groups in relation to the broader processes of value creation and capital accumulation in that place. Second, situating this process of revaluation within the changing power geometry of a historical conjuncture. This is the temporality aspect. You cannot talk about those revaluation processes outside of the temporality. It is a very contextual one, but it is not simply that the context of that the city, it is connected to the context of the whatever that is used as the context is related with the broader dynamics of capital accumulation. I think here it is very important to note that the capital is a social relationship. Those who understand capital to be a set of unequal social relations repeatedly underline the legitimizing narratives of racialized, culturalized, and gendered differences. That is to say, the coloniality of power as being fundamental to appropriations and the dispossessive processes underlying capital accumulation. People who had worked on colonialism know this could not forget that, because this is how the racialized logics that worked with the slavery, it worked that way. But also the people who worked on gender that know about this decoloniality of power being very, very intrinsic to the generation of wealth and fundamental to the appropriations. These people are worthless. That is so that you could pay less. That's a very very banal way of it. But so we know this from, as I said, from slavery, dispossessed labor, to racialized discourses. These group of people who underline and emphasize that capital is a social relationship, they rightly urge us to analyze both processes in relationship to each other. So you could not understand capital accumulation outside of those racialized, gendered, culturalized logic. However, so we know this, and there's a huge literature about that. However, once these constructed differences take the form of a positive valuation, as it is case in the narratives of diversity and community politics, and people who are familiar with my work that know that my allergies to those kind of diversity and community politics, these value regimes are often approached as if they were detached from the structures and processes of dispossession underlying capital accumulation. People do not ask, why do they become such a value at particular period of time? And for me, this was not possible not to ask it in Mardin, because these were the people who were chased away, who were killed, who fled their life. Suddenly, they became the most important value for that city. So minor groups, such as a small group. Building upon this understanding of capital, I approached the striking valorization of different groups and their concomitant empowerment. Of course, this revalorization brings a kind of an empowerment of for those groups as part of capital and urban structuring, geared to establishing the competitive worth of the place within the context of uneven spatial globalization. That is, I think, should be clear. So consequently, I call for situating both the devalorization and valorization processes vis-a-vis marginalized groups and together with their persecution and displacement, but their acquisition of prominence as assets of linguistic and religious diversity within a common analytical lens. As you had seen, that I was trying to put migrants and non-migrants within a common analytical lens to be able to excavate what becomes well in terms of the in analyzing the dynamics of dispossession, displacement, and placement. And here it is that is trying to see it as regimes of value, putting the devalorization and valorization within the same analytical lens. So when in my own work on the Martin one, I was able to show how culturalized, racialized logic, they were chased away because of their culture, because of their religion. And they were valorized because of their culture, because of their religion. So this takes out the pressure from the quote-unquote cultural or ethnic group with their kind of intrinsic, quote-unquote intrinsic capacities or the ways of life. So the revaluing processes of Syriac Christians, if you want, we could talk in the discussion, were embedded into a multiscalar field with very powerful supranational and global, as well as national and regional actors. And one was that the supranational powers such as EU has been particularly very present in the making of the religious and linguistic differences a value. As part of its cultural and religious rights regimes. But not only, that UNESCO was also very strongly present. However, the changing configurations, so this is I think it should be clear. So, however, the changing configurations, there I talk about the mix and potency of intersecting multiscalar networks of disparate power. This is what I refer to the historical conjuncture, that the kind of the mix of potency, the power geometry, are crucial understanding the temporality of value regimes. This revaluation of the Syriac Christians took place at a particular time. We had to look at it, what was happening at that time, and it was actually the Turkey's efforts for the EU accession, and then afterwards the Iraq War, and trying to keep a Christian population also from the end. The Christians became a much more valorized group to keep in that geography in relation to very strong religious power networks, including the Catholic and Orthodox Christian networks. So this was okay. So what did we find in terms of those when we looked at this one? So I will. How much time I have now?
10 minutes, yeah.
Yeah?
Minutes, yeah.
5?
I mean, I could listen to another half hour. But
No. We want a discussion. Maybe. No. I think I will finish in 10 minutes. Okay? Okay. So, because of this broader context and importance of the attracting capital and investment to the city, migration and migrant-friendly narratives of such disempowered, welcoming cities are closely enmeshed with business and investment-friendly narratives. So it's not only going that in terms of we want that diversity, we want migrants, but at the parallel to that, we want investment, we want capital, we want global talent in our cities. This proved to be crucial in disempowered cities. As our research showed, despite different regional histories, demographic composition, and different institutional and discursive resources available for economic and urban development in the cities that we focus. One is in the US, one is in Germany, former GDR, one is on the border of Syria and Turkey. City leaders all responded to the challenges of restructuring of capital by embracing welcoming narratives that placed migrants, but also refugees, as well as minorities. So it depends, actually. I'm not making a big difference there, as important assets to the desired economic growth and prosperity of their cities. Moreover, in these cities, the revitalization of city centers and the presence of migrants, refugees became also important to perform the safe, open, and business-friendly environment of the city. For Halle, it was very important to have the presence of the migrants to perform that we are world open. We are open to friendly, to attract capital, foreign capital, and investment and global talent. That because it had a reputation of being a racist city. Manchester had the reputation of a dangerous city to attract. And Mardin was also that it was against all sorts of diversity. It was very hostile to, and it was a city of terror and violence. To get outside of that, to fight those negative images as racist, dangerous, shrinking, or declining cities. The following similarities emerged among these seemingly disparate cities. We found that while migrant-friendly narratives, and I think this is where that the radicalized politics come into it, where migrant-friendly narratives did not develop into migrant-specific policies. So there is this migrant welcoming narratives, but nothing has been done. These cities there is a very upfront discourse, but once you look at the policies, there is no clear policies with clear budgeting, funding in these cities. The business investment friendly narratives indeed developed into a plethora of programs and incentives to attract capital and investment. There is a very big discrepancy. For the capital, for the foreign investment, so what they did, they provided subsidies, tax rebates, abolishment of business and corporate tax. So provision of public resources, common and treasury land to corporate capital below market prices to attract the businesses there. So the city regeneration in disempowered cities was very much shaped by a dependence on public funding, which was very weak in these cities to start with. And bear in mind that you have also the narrative about the foreigners, the migrants, that they will regenerate our standing and our image. Nothing is being done there, but in relation to the business capital, yes. Although these cities attracted some corporate and private investors and multinational investments, public revenue streams of these cities did not increase. So they attracted the capital, but these cities did not become richer. On the contrary, all these regeneration projects left the cities with even fewer resources for public services. In fact, in all these cities, the city debt increased after a decade of urban projects of economic growth. Migrants, refugees, or the impoverished residents often became assets, and they did in cities we focused, for the city developers to access supranational, as I said, to EU, UNDP, UNESCO, and public funding in US housing and urban development for the regeneration renewal project. In the name of refugees, in the name of migrants, these funds have been generated, but nothing has been done for these people. So they are very much upfront. Nothing is being done, but also these are provided to the corporate capital, that the basis of they become more impoverished. In all these, all these rebuilding efforts filled the coffers of the developers, multinational corporations, and public-private partnerships. In all these three cities, disparities and poverty drastically increased. Dispossession and displacements intensified, although they attracted capital. So this, what does this, what happened? Okay, I forgot. Somehow it didn't come. There are some opportunities and challenges that they came within that context. These led to two contradictory developments. How come? Maybe they okay.
These are the hidden consequences.
Yeah, okay. These dynamics led to two contradictory developments, providing opportunities but also challenges to migrant emplacement. First, the disempoweredness of these cities ironically provided also opportunities for migrants to keep the city centers to be revitalized. The migrants were put offered some opportunities, but also they offered opportunities for migrants and refugees to find and establish domains of commonality with the dispossessed and displaced city residents. In the context of eroded public coffers, there were no city resources invested in provisioning migrant-specific services, let alone religious or ethnic community-based services. There is a lip service, but they don't have the money to provide anything to their own quote-unquote native residents. So there is not that kind of a provision of public services. So, however, this lack of resources and programs for the institutionalization of ethnic and religious difference opened opportunities. So they could not institutionalize those differences. They opened opportunities for migrants, refugees, and the natives to build sociabilities based on domains of commonality and to be active together in local politics as well as within urban social justice movements. This domain of commonality established over difference become more visible in disempowered cities than in more powerful and well-resourced cities. It is noteworthy that in Germany, one of the very first two Black German members of parliament who initially arrived as a refugee was in Halle, not in Frankfurt or in Berlin. Manchester, not in New York, or Los Angeles, elected the very first Muslim citizen to a U.S. state legislature. And the first elected Syriac Christian mayor in Turkey was in Mardin, not in Istanbul or in Ankara. Most importantly, none of these migrants became part of the local political scene, not on the basis of being Black, ethnic or religious communitarian politics and constituencies, but on politics of social justice, challenging the increasing disparities in their respective cities. So I think this came out from the research. Second, but this is one part, the opportunities, but the challenges. Second, in a context where the revenues decreased, public resources eroded, public services failed, and disparities and debt increased, the peculiar combination of migrant-friendly narratives with the business, capital, foreign, business also foreign, multinational, friendly narratives in urban redevelopment paved the ground for increased racism. Migrants, as foreigners, are increasingly made the scapegoat of the effects of dispossessive dynamics of capital accumulation and of draining public resources for the provision of public services to city residents. Remember that they were used to reach out certain centers of power or to get certain funds, although there was nothing provided for them, but that paved the road actually to make them a scapegoat for increased racism. So in all these cities, what we observed was a kind of a radicalized, polarized politics. So at one point, there was the social justice movements where the migrants, refugees, and city residents were together there, and they were not arguing for communitarian and cultural politics, but for social justice movements. On the other hand, that you had actually some former migrants who had settled there, together with some that with the rage and the anger that came out with the erosion of the public resources, joined to made the migrants and the foreigners as the scapegoat and made a very racialized politics. So it came as a kind of a very polarized field. This has very strong, I think, consequences in terms of the research, ethnography, spatial and temporal frames of ethnography, but I will leave it here, and I think I will stop here. Oh, thanks very much.
I will stay here. Thanks a lot indeed. This was an extremely rich presentation with such close reading of your comparative spaces, but also a very stringent and complex theoretization of your approaches, which I think is quite fascinating. And also thank you for packing this into such a short corpus, but giving such a rich, really entry into your work, but also indeed into how to rethink and to re-evaluate. to re-evaluate this pressing issue. There we have a different expertises here in the seminar, and before I have a couple of questions that I would like to raise, but I would like and prefer to give first the floor to colleagues present in the room. So the floor is open. Who will jump in first? Daniel? Sorry, Daniel?
Yeah,
yes,
I
please.
can go after you.
No, after you, please.
Please, Daniel.
Please.
Yes.
Okay, my name is Daniel Mokonnen. I'm a senior co-fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study. And I liked your presentation, which was very enlightening.
A little bit louder, Daniel.
Okay.
Acoustics are bad in this room. Now that the provost is gone, we can
Okay,
say
I will start.
It's not good.
Yes, my name is Daniel Mokonnen. I'm a senior co-fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study. Originally, I'm from Eritrea, which is one of the most discussed countries in current migration debates in Europe. And personally, I have been very much affected by migration and mobility because for the last 17 years, I have lived in 10 different European countries.
Welcome to the club.
Thank you very much. So I have several questions, but let me ask my first question and then see how you respond to that, and then maybe I can come up with my second round of questions, because my assumption is that your research addresses also, or is it the case that you focus only on migrants, which are different from, in my understanding, from refugees or victims of forced migration, as we sometimes call them. But since you also touched on a number of issues which are equally relevant to refugees as well, I'm asking my questions based on that assumption, but I stand to be corrected if my assumption is wrong. So I wanted to ask on this very particular issue, the so-called phenomenon of proliferation of parallel societies, or what I call underprivileged segments of society, especially in Europe at large. As we speak now, Europe is actually experiencing the largest, I would say, arrival of refugees since the end of the Second World War, with the UNHCR telling us that in 2016, the number has gone way beyond 60,000 globally. So the issue of integration is becoming very problematic in many ways, but in my own understanding, it's very much related to integration programs and systems throughout Europe, which are archaic and primitive in many ways, which do not come up to the demands of contemporary challenges of integration. So how do you see the direction of European migration debate in this context? Where do you think the debate will go some 10, 15 years from now? So I ask this question, as I said before, because these issues are equally relevant to migrants and refugees alike. And of course, as I said before, I may come back again with another set of questions, but let me hear first your feedback on this. Thank you very much again.
Okay, Thank you. Should I respond immediately? Yes.
I think, yeah. Then we take them one by one.
So, first of all, I'm not making a big difference neither with the migrants and the non-migrants analytically. I do not put them a priori into very different categories. Because we know that, I mean, even within the citizenship, we know that you could have certain rights without citizenship, and you could not be able to use your rights with the citizenship. So that I'm not putting in terms of all those legal categories. Migrants, refugees, and forced labor, of course, there are some differences, but it just depends. It is a very gray area. So I'm taking all of them. And that's why in many of the places I was talking to, for example, Syria Christians, actually, they did not come from anywhere. They were the minority, actually, they were there much longer. So but they became a kind of a minority. So I put also minorities and marginalized groups. But in coming back to your question about the integration, actually my whole effort is try to go beyond that kind of integration programs and thinking within that kind of a logic. What are we doing? How could we integrate these people better? And who becomes integratable? Who is deserving to be part of that society? Trying to get beyond that. Of course, within that kind of the integrationist logic, not only that for example in Austria, that now what I'm seeing is that actually it's going back to the programs of 60s, where everyone saw that nothing happened. Actually, it backfires, but so it is not even going back to the programs of the 80s, really 60s, 70s. So I try to develop a kind of a framework with the unease that I have with those terminologies and programs with integration, because integration singles out the groups very well in terms of as migrants who have to become in a particular way, God knows what that is, to be part of that society. And that society is neither homogeneous, and in terms of the privileges and rights also not homogeneous. So I don't. So you could ask your other question.
I'll come back later.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Aziz, and then Prem.
No, I just basically I want to make a couple of laudatory comments on what you said. This is very. It's a systematization of quite a number of things that are being said critically with regard to these common discourses on ethnicity, on migration, on integration and so forth, because there is, as you said, a certain presumption of homogeneity, which in fact does not obtain. Now, if I were simply to give one particular kind of example, which is also of particular interest to this particular Striking from the Margins project, namely one particular type of commonality, which is the commonality of what we might call, you call them precarious, dispossessed, which one might say structurally inchoate underclass under present conditions, right? A structurally inchoate underclass, which then, of course, in a process of revaluation and devalorization at the same time, at its extreme fringes, takes two particular directions. One direction, of course, is the kind of constituency out of which Daesh, ISIS, recruits. The other, of course, of people coming from structurally congruent conditions, the extreme fringes of European fascists. Now, of course, both of them emphasize the revaluation by the ostentatious display of identitarian markers, In one case, beards, terms of speech, versus patterns of behavior. The other, a certain liking for a particular kind of rock music, very ostentatious tattooing of the heads and the necks, and particular kinds of dress, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, both these kinds of groups are congruent in yet another way, namely the dynamics of group formation, the internal dynamics of group formation and of recruitment from particular types of networks, particular types of secrecy, and of course, in both cases, again, with structural congruence, there is a very close proximity to underclasses organized as gangs, criminal gangs, right? Criminal gangs of various descriptions, and incidentally also of bikers. Now, if you were to look at the situation in a city like Brussels, for instance, which you know, of course, better than all of us here, these commonalities in between groups actually do arise, and they're very evident. They were very evident in the Bataclan group that led this. So, given structural congruence, how does one then, of course, think, quite apart from the obvious ways, of different kinds of outcomes? That is to say, why do second or third generation Moroccans in a city like Brussels, who might join a bikers club, and some of them do, and they do have their own bikers club, why do they not then veer towards a local kind of fascism rather than a transnational antinomianism? Because they are both antinomian, right? Both manifestations are antinomian, and they're antinomian from the vantage point of an underclass, of a structural underclass, of long-term. This is a long-term underclass which will persist since the neoliberal reforms, and these things are actually becoming more and more important. Then you find, of course, similar things in a different setting if one were to look at some Syrian cities, but that's a different question. My question is specific to you. How do you explain different kinds of outcomes?
First of all, thanks a lot. There's quite a lot in it. Yes, but I think I go a little bit beyond that kind of the homogeneity kind of stuff that is neither in the nation states, of course we don't have, and then the ethnic racial. And I think that that's why I put the urban and then the city making and the migrants all together, because these dynamics are really the settings where you have whether you have certain access to discursive institutional resources. I'm not asking only institutional resources, but also discursive resources and legacies. That's why I think these institutional and discursive legacies and resources that could be reached, not necessarily locally, but the local conjuncture shapes your values to where to, how to reach those ones. So, in relation to your specific question, in terms of with the dynamics of group formation and those kind of transnational networks, strong boundaries so that you establish. I think this is really with the revaluation process that comes as chains of equivalences, where I had the fortune and unfortune of having done a research on the right-wing fascist movement in Turkey. Then afterwards I was so scared and I left. I did not pursue. But there I saw it very, very clearly, actually. It is that, like you say, the shape of a beard or the mustache or this and that kind of stuff, it has nothing to do with actually historically with anything. But it is, within that conjunction comes the chains of equivalences, but what comes very important is that the transnational networks of these people, because I will come back to the Brussels example, that the more that you have, you are cut off. And here the discursive resources and legacies play an important role. The more you are cut off, although I think that there are migrants in the fascist groups too, it is also local fascist groups too. So why your question is that why they are opting for the kind of the transnational fascist groups or groups of violence, and then show those kind of gang characteristics. I think gang characteristics are very similar to the local any kind of groups. In Austria, the Burschenschaft, you could also study them as in terms of gang characteristics, that very closed
secret society,
secret societies, and then with those kind of, so it is not in no one's monopoly. But why they are not becoming part of it? First of all, I think that they have better access to resources through those transnational networks and the discursive legacies that, again, I take the discourses very seriously, not necessarily in terms of the what they are doing it. So in those local groups, they include some kinds of people who are of migration origin, quote unquote, or foreigners, but they're not discursively there in it. The Austrian guy was also had with those songs scandal, had a kind of a migration origin background, quote unquote, the background, but it is not there as such. So, but in the other one, it's like those kind of the black, what Stuart Hall had written, that trying to redefine its content. Okay, you use it as a derogatory, I acquire power on that basis. And there isn't enough transnational kind of a network, and that allows them, I think, I don't know, but this is what I have observed. In terms of those two directions, that the one that went to the ISIS, then in those broader dynamics, which goes to the one that I referred to, the increased racism, actually this is also the disappointed middle classes. Middle classes are, they're not there with the gang characteristics or any kind of stuff, but they contribute very strongly, and it also provides them a means to I would not use the word dignity. I'm very cautious about them. But it becomes a venue to, like those disempowered cities, trying to yearn for their lost power. I don't know whether that answers your question.
No, it does indeed. If I may make one sentence, just one sentence.
But
only one sentence. I would just want to assert, as a conclusion from what I heard, is that when we speak of cultural congruence between these groups who go either to Daesh or to the extreme right, we're actually talking of two groups that are equally integrated. That is to say, those migrants or those of migrant background are fully integrated, and that this phenomenon actually is the product of integration into that situation, which then gives them a particular type of.
Of course, so they're not outside of the system. Indeed. Actually, this is part of it, and they learned also very well to play that game. Also, where to and how to access. Of course, not everyone has the equal access to resources, unequal power, but this is not not distributed. Migrants have this kind of power, and non-migrants have this kind of power. I'm trying to give a kind of a more dynamic kind of a picture.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ayse. This inspiring as well to hear you speak. And as you said, there's a lot of commonalities in what you're doing now and what I'm doing now. So I'll try and be brief. I have maybe 4 questions or comments. I'll be very brief.
Brief ones are 4. Okay.
The first one is I agree, and it's not a critique of your choice of disempowered cities and your usage of scale makes a lot of sense. But I wonder what types of common forms of marginalization that you miss by not looking at global cities. What are the forms of common politics or common forms of dispossession that are articulated better because of global capitalist restructuring in other scales, other cities of other scale, or other sites beyond cities that the focus on disempowered cities, which makes a lot of sense, doesn't necessarily shed light on. Second is about your use of displacement rather than mobility, which I completely agree with. Mobility is an overused and under-theorized term, which is very sexy, but it doesn't really explain very much. I like the way you talk about displacement. It takes into account also this process of dispossession and so on. And one thing you haven't mentioned, which I think maybe is also maybe more common at different, if you look at a different scale, is forms of, this is a problematic term, but forms of immobilization.
Yes.
Either through encampment, ghettoization, and so on.
Yes.
And I wonder whether you see that playing out in the cities in which you talk about and how that is related to these valorization regimes and the capacity of migrants to render themselves valuable. Third is the idea of valorization, and I like very much how you talk about value regimes within cities, within neighborhoods change, the meaning of social reproduction in the cities change, and the possibility of cities change, and so on. One thing I may have missed, I'm sorry if I did, you don't talk here about the interaction, or the way in which local regimes of value interact with state or state-like aspirations of value, specifically imaginations of desirable publics to be protected.
Whose imagination?
State-like offices. I don't necessarily want to say the state because it's much more disparate than that, but things that take on the role of state-like authorities and the way in which they imagine specific publics and the difficulties that migrants have in valorizing themselves in relation to this. So how these broader scales of valorization impact on value regimes in cities. And fourth, finally, just very briefly about coloniality of power. I agree, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you think about that, because some of my problems with people who think about colonialities of power is the spatial issues. You know, that this is something which is apparent and has been apparent historically in the global south, whatever that is, but it belongs to a different order of capitalism and national state-making, which is not prevalent in Europe. I think that's problematic, and I think what we call coloniality of power are forms of, as you say, this sort of racialized social relations of capitalism, which are not located in, it doesn't have to be the same.
Of course. Okay. I will start from the reverse order. For the coloniality power, that's why I bring there, because I'm aware of the discussion, and it is all as if that is this in this global south. But that's why I said I emphasize that the capital is a social relation, and it could never the value was never extracted outside of that social relations. The social relations are intrinsic to this extraction of capital, and there the race, culture, gender, and plays a role. And this is definitely not. I'm using it for the revaluation within the value regimes. On purpose, I use it so to take it outside of that the global south anchoring of it. And there, actually, I refer, and I think Butler did a lot to open this. And if you read Butler together with the coloniality of power, then you understand that this global south anchoring is not really, it doesn't hold. In terms of that, the common forms of, then I go to your first question. common forms of marginalization, whether I'm missing or not, by not looking at those kind of global cities. I'm not saying that every city has the same kind of forms of communalization, marginalization, but I'm trying to see really domains of commonality. Why? Because I'm coming from the migration scholarship and also in the urban scholarship too, as if that there's a very elaborate urban social justice movements literature which do not look at migrants at all. They're not, I mean, not even, they should not have a separate category, but there's not even an awareness of it to establish a kind of a ground to be able to see. In the quote unquote those powerful, globally powerful cities, let's say that the global cities, I think every city is global in one way or other, but in those global cities, common forms of marginalization, which ones you have in mind? They might have very different resources. Actually, because they have different resources, they have institutionalized the provision of services also on the ethnic and cultural lines, unless they turn to diversity politics that they learned not to give to the Turks, Iranians, and the Syrians. So all have to come together, and we are the diverse. But I don't know which ones you have that I think that what would be the ones that the common forms of marginalization in the global cities?
Maybe we're looking at it from slightly. I'm interested in the way in which people are similarly positioned before local structures of capitalism. And I think you can see how these play out in cities of different scale, in similar but also interestingly nuanced ways across.
Okay. Then I would say that this is where I would put it in terms of actually the legacies. But the legacies of this, how they had, but because this is what you're referring, but the legacies is never a path dependency, because this is what I have a problem with those kind of path dependency. The legacy becomes acquires an importance in relation to the regimes of value that at a particular time. So the legacy is important, but which legacy will be picked up when, by whom, and to do what? That I would look at it. But this is not an all-encompassing. So trying to create a kind of a vocabulary, maybe one could look with that through that lens to the global cities too. Forms of immobilization that actually, that's why I referred to you, that is the mobility actually, obscures the forms of immobilization. Interestingly, Halle was a city of immobilization. That created those kind of the opportunities, because in Halle the refugees were, and the first black one that I referred to, he came as a refugee too. And then as refugees, you are not allowed to move outside of a particular kind of a radius. But then afterwards, actually, they were immobilized in that sense. But this did not. So mobility and immobility might not be a good indicator of your access to power and resources. That I would say. And what was it that state and state-like offices, and that the migrants, of course, they might be aspiring those ones, but that in terms of those kinds of the aspirations where they are cut off. This is what you're referring to, or am I getting you wrong?
But maybe let other people ask.
Okay, then you come back, because maybe I'm not that clear. It might be related with Ayse's question, actually.
For the sake of time, may I ask both Erika and Haru to have not 4 questions, but maybe just one.
Maybe like 3 short comments. First of all, thank you for just repeating Nadia and Fran for this very interesting and compact presentation. My name is Ayse Caglar. I'm the senior program manager for the Romanist Studies program at CEU. But I am here just as for personal interest, together with my husband, who's from Turkey, and he's been actually involved with refugees and migrants in Budapest the past year. But I'm possibly an odd man out or an odd woman out with my question, which comes from linguistics, because I have a linguistics background by academic training. And I may be shooting into totally wrong directions, but what I really liked, and this is a comment about your using of concepts like emplacement or displacement, it reminded me, like in linguistics, in the old days, pre-Chomsky times, we used to use concepts like subject and object. And later on, with developments of all sorts, terms like agent and patient have been introduced in linguistics analysis. And agent is determined through its relationship to the action expressed by the verb. Patient describes receiver that changes state, and it's very much reminded me of your thoughts and comments on processes and processual concepts, dynamics and interaction. And that's why I really like these new concepts from just a semantic point of view as a biased linguist. And it takes me to another question of maybe that when you use mobility as opposed to in contradiction with displacement, and you mentioned that mobility is a slippery concept. And I was thinking, just based on my interactions with Hungarians, with stereotypes or racist remarks, why are these migrants and refugees coming here? Why are they moving? What's this mobility? And I think mobility is more attackable, as a scapegoat of racism, rather than displacement. It's more of a neutral and more protective of a category for me. I don't know whether you agree with this or not. And I don't know how much you professionals in the field work with, let's say, the semantic concept of migrants in Hungarian. 3 years ago, nobody used the word migrants in Hungarian. We had words for refugees, and it's a very loaded category. And
whom does it refer to before?
I'm sorry?
Whom did it refer to before?
We did not use the term. We used bevándorló, we used all kinds of other synonyms, but no, this is a very loaded political category, I think, very much attached to the used and abused by the nation-state concept, not naming names and pointing fingers. So this is just my, first of all, compliment and comment on the terms and terminology, and I was wondering about your you are comparing mobility and displacement in terms of this
Maybe we can
yes.
have Harouk just add his question.
Yes, thank you very much. Connected to the question, we concluded that the radically polarized politics is some sort of an unintended consequence of contradictory developments in the migration regime. My question is about the political function of this polarized politics. So yes, it is an unintended consequence, but it seems to me that it's also a ferociously pursued political agenda in so many different contexts. So it must have some sort of a political meaning function beyond the unintended consequence. And here specifically, I'm asking about its correlations with the rise of right-wing conservative politics. And also, it's striking to me that the way in which radicalized theology pursued by ISIS, for instance, despite the religious noise, if you boil it down, it comes back to a basic structure of total enmity, us and them, trying to create the same polarized politics, which highlights the group formation process. So.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Let me go. I mean, Erica's one was a comment, actually. The other one with the mobility and displacement, I think you're very right in terms of the concept of mobility neutralizes the issue. There is also very strong voluntariness in the concept of mobility. And whenever I remember that when I started using the term displacement, actually for about 6-7 years ago, all my colleagues said that, oh, that is, you're denying the agency. That is, the mobility is more with the agency, but actually I'm more convinced that the mobility is a very misleading concept there, because the moment that you say displacement, then you have to think about some other place where this person was connected, and there is this kind of violence and force involved in that. In the mobility, no. So that is why I think semantically it does something. In terms of the migrant as a new concept, that does not surprise me also, because I remember that Alexandra would remember when I came, started first teaching here, and everyone said that, oh, Hungary does not have migration policy, so that the Hungary should have a migration policy because EU was, for the accession, they had to have a migration policy. They said that we don't have migrants, and I said that, how come you don't have migrants? What are those Chinese doing here? And what are all those people from Romania are they doing? They said that no, they're not migrants. So they are not. How come? They are anchored in the diaspora politics. So the term migrant had really, I mean, it is very much related with the history of this country. I think.
If I ask Hungarians, native speakers, about the term refugee as opposed to migrant in Hungarian, like menekül is sort of neutral, but migráns is like a curse word. And it's the development of the past few years.
Okay, but that is very much related in terms of, again, with the mobilities, seeing like a state, and this is very much seeing like that the Hungarian state. In terms of the political function of polarized politics, I'm finishing. So that is okay.
Not meant to shut you up.
Yeah, the political function of the polarized politics, and I'm saying that yes, they were the unintended consequences. Yes and no, because they were not the unintended consequences, because everyone knew that these projects, these structures, and this kind of the whole process of regeneration would create this amount of dispossessed people. So it was not unintended consequences. That was actually part of the package, but it was not, of course, put there. It was that's why I say that language masks the inequalities. What else goes together? But in terms of the political function of so it is not, we can't treat it as a kind of the polarized politics in the German, like a Betriebsunfall. That's not a kind of a casualty that happened in on the way. Partly it was the product of that process, but not only that. That's why I was always underlying the historical conjuncture right now. So it makes a difference if that kind of a process was happening 20 years ago and today. In terms of those kinds of radicalized groups, you have very different sources of power, not necessarily in that very locality, but you for any kind of quote unquote fascistic movement, then you are much better off now than 20 or 30 years ago, so that you can connect. So that's why I come back to Ayse's question, that rather than making them as unique that they like the Ayses, to show that they are the products of, they are the similar kind of processes, and they share quite a lot. But this is not the kind of the shared domains of commonality I was aiming at. So, and they have a political function, of course. They divide the discursive field in an antagonistic way, us and them. The moment that you divide the political field in an antagonistic way, that you have a much easier totalitarian regimes, I think. That's how I would respond to it. But it's a very, it's an important thing to pursue. How come now this acquires a different kind of a function?
Thank you so much, Ayse. I mean, this was not only a very, in the literal sense, a very instructive seminar as we need and as you build this up with a lot of discussion, but obviously the feeling is that we just started the discussion, and I think it would be, at least for us from the research group, very, very important maybe to, if ever your time will allow it, to have one other session in which we see how that what you have explained, which of course is transferable to other situations, but since you also stress so much really the context and situation, that we see how we can use this, or to what extent, to areas we are concerned with. And I think in particular this your scaling approach and the focus not on the big capitals but on the cities in between is something which is of utmost importance for what we are interested in. So thank you ever so much for really a wonderful seminar and talk, and for the discussions, and thank you.
Thank you very much.